Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the main meeting for the Triangle Area SQL Server Users Group. It is June 16th, 2020, and with us tonight we have the one and only Melissa Coates, who's going to talk to us about administration of Power BI. So with that, I am going to hand it straight off to Melissa to take it away.
Excellent. Well, hi, everyone. I am talking to you from North Carolina, I'm about 2 hours south of where this user group would typically meet in normal times. So good evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you happen to be at the moment. And yeah, as Kevin said, we are going to talk about Power BI administration. And I basically have three goals for this session. One is to really talk about how the administrator role might vary based on the different kinds of BI approaches that you are using, and really just introduce the breadth of responsibilities that you might need to be taking on. So that's your hint that this is very much an overview session. Unfortunately, we don't really have time to dive into a lot of details for most of them. So it's more of an awareness session. And then we're going to conclude with some next steps. So based on where you're at right now, a few suggestions for what you might do next. And we have 1.5 hours slated for this session. We're going to go ahead and stop in between each one of the sections to check for Q&A. So use the normal box in the platform to put those in, and Kevin will read them out to me when we stop. Here are all the different sections that we are going to cover start to end. And in addition to stopping at each section, we'll also have 10 or 15 minutes at the end to handle some Q&A as well. If you would like to grab a copy of the slides that we are about to review, here's the URL where you can go and get them. And there's also a diagram that you're about to see, and that's the URL to go and get that diagram as well. Throughout this session, I'm going to ask you 6 or 7 questions. And so I'd like you to participate. And here's the URL for how to do that. And if you will open a browser window, or if you happen to have the Poll Everywhere app, but if you don't, just open a browser window and go to the URL shown in the middle here. And this is how we're going to have a little bit of fun interactivity and learn some things about you while we go along. So let's start with one. I would like to know if administration is formally or technically part of your job role. So far, our results are all in the not official bucket of responders. So I'll give it another few seconds, see if we have anybody else that wants to dive in. I would rarely expect to see a full timer up at the top. Okay, very interesting. Thank you. And I have one more for you right now. And that would be, which one of these 3 categories would at least resonate as closely as possible to where you work? All right. Interestingly, a few days ago, the results were flipped. We had many more people in that 3rd category. Okay. Very nice. All right. All right. Leave that browser window open. We're going to return to that here in a little bit. But for right now, where I want to start is a little bit of level setting on some approaches, roles, responsibilities. Now, this is that diagram I mentioned a minute ago, and we're not going to review or step through this in depth. But Power BI is a very broad set of tools, and it integrates with a lot of other things as well. So when someone says to you Power BI, what do they mean? Do they mean the service? Do they mean desktop? Do they mean the entire ecosystem as a whole? And so if you're not extremely familiar with Power BI yet, really what I want you to know now is that it's more than just a reporting tool. And that's really why it needs a lot of attention to management, governance, security, etc. Now, it's also really difficult to say, well, what falls under the umbrella of Power BI administration? And so there's all these other things that, depending on the size of your company and how staffing is structured, your administrator might be asked to get involved with a lot of these other things as well. So what Power BI administration is going to be different a little bit, at least for a lot of you. But where I'm really going to focus on is that dead center, the things that are common to most everybody. Now let's talk a moment about BI approaches, because this does affect how you turn around and administer the system. And so there's generally these three broad approaches that we tend to talk about. The first column is the business functional users really are doing everything end to end. They handle their data preparation all the way through the report delivery. And you contrast that to the far right, where your corporate or centralized BI team is handling everything end to end. And then you have what we tend to think of as the sweet spot in the middle, where you've got some centralization for the data, but the report creation is more decentralized, and that part is more flexible. And so where you're at, your starting place might be column one for some companies, and that might or might not be pretty chaotic, depending on your overall data culture and your level of maturity for data management. Now, it might be column three for another company, especially if a successful corporate data warehouse is in place. Here's the thing, though, is that all three of them are probably all existing at once in most organizations of any size. And it could be a different group or a different project really has a different way that they approach BI. And so that means your involvement as an administrator might actually differ based on which group you're serving. The other things that start to impact your roles and responsibilities are, what is it that you're delivering? Organizational BI is always going to have more oversight than something that has less consumers. And organizational BI or corporate BI, whatever we want to call it, is always going to, by its nature, be a little bit less flexible and less agile. And we want that to be true. We want it to go through more change management and have more rigor than at the bottom left, where, of course, it's more agile and flexible. And finally, internally, you've got things that how your company runs now. And when I say data management maturity level, if you're not at the top of the maturity curve, that's not always a bad thing. That's not always the goal. And things around the culture that is being advocated definitely impact a whole lot of things with overseeing a tool like Power BI. And then, of course, there's external things, our favorite compliance and regulatory requirements, and even things that are happening in the industry, right? That where your executives might be asking you to start doing different things in order to be competitive. So lots and lots of different influences. So having said all that, who is permitted to be a Power BI administrator? And there's this this battle of, we want people to be able to get things done, but that comes with risk, and we don't want to have too many people with these highly elevated permissions. And it absolutely is a more elevated type of a role. And so you're going to hear me say this a couple of times. So this is one of two times. And that is, since an administrator has control over the tenant, they can make things in the workspace available to them which in turn means any of the data could in turn be made available to an administrator should they choose to go and adjust the security. And that's really important to know because typically we say, no big deal, it's just the metadata. Well, until the security is adjusted. So I tend to think of it as a highly elevated role. Considering it is, how do we start thinking about reducing the number of people that are in this highly elevated role? And there's a very cool feature in Azure that's called Privileged Identity Management, or PIM. And the idea is that it gives you just temporary or just-in-time access to these kinds of roles. And you could do this for our Power BI administrator or your global administrator and a whole bunch of other roles and so forth. And so let me walk you through, I'm going to show you what it looks like in a second, but let me walk you through theoretically what's happening. So your PIM administrator is going to set this up and say who's eligible to have this just-in-time access. And then the person that's eligible, in our case, that's going to be Griffin is his name. When Griffin needs to do something, and for instance, maybe he needs to update a tenant setting, he's going to request to activate it. And then if you want, you can have somebody approve that. It doesn't have to go through an approval. It could just, in fact, log it that this happened. And then once it goes through, Griffin, this person that requested it, will become a member of this administrator role, but only temporarily for the 4 or 6 or 8 hours that he asked for it to get the activity done, and then they will be removed from the role at expiration time. So that's very cool. Let me show you what this looks like. So where I'm at here is in Privileged Identity Management in Azure, and it actually has its own service. And so where I'm going to go, we can do this for Azure resources, but in this case, what I'm focused on is an Azure AD role. So I'm going to choose that under Manage. And under Assign Eligibility, that first choice that we had, and I'm going to sort descending over here by the active column. And what we're seeing here is that in my demo tenant here, I have, for the global administrator and then the one that we're focused on, the Power BI administrator, I have said that I have basically one active rule and I've set up one person to be eligible. And what this looks like is, here's my guy, his name's Griffin. We've said that he's permanently eligible to be added to this role. And there's a few other settings that we can add and so forth. And so then what happens, I'm going to go over here to a different session where I'm actually logged in as Griffin. And so when he says I need to do something, what he's going to do is he's going to go into PIM and go to my roles, and he's going to say, oh, okay, I'm eligible for either one of these. And I need to be a Power BI administrator. And he's going to request to activate it. See this action over here on the far right. So then we've got a max of 10 hours. We can say, I only need. Okay, so I think then the only thing that we really kind of missed there is taking a look at the email that my approver received, and my approver then went in and said, yes, it's okay. Then they received the acknowledgement that, it was enabled, what the start and end was, and then Griffin was able to go on and do his thing. So from there, we started talking about who's in the Power BI admin role permanently. And so I'm in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center here under the Power BI admin role, and was just illustrating that Peyton is here permanently. Griffin is not, because we were handling him in the alternative method. So that kind of catches us up. And so really where I want to take the conversation here is we can add individuals to those admin roles in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. But I want to advocate that there's also a good reason to also have a male-enabled security group for your Power BI administrators. And I wish we could turn around and just add that to the admin role. Not possible right now, fingers crossed in the future, but not right now. So the reasons that would be useful are things like we can use that for workspace security and our own auditing and health and reporting where we're managing Power BI. So BI on BI kind of an idea. There's a variety of tenant settings where we're going to basically give permissions to a certain group. Service notifications if something is wrong is a perfect example of using this Power BI administrators group. We might also want to set some alert policies, which I'm going to show you here in a couple of minutes. And then, just your miscellaneous, sending people emails, etc. So when we talk about Power BI Administrator, there's a number of different kinds of administrators. And so in your company, when you use the word, the question will be, are we talking about just the service administrator? And a lot of times the first three of them, the service, the gateway, premium capacity, a lot of times those all get coupled together and they're the same person, but they don't have to be. Now there's also a ton of various different responsibilities. This isn't a full-on list, but here's the thing is that your Power BI administrator is going to have, their core things that they're worried about, but they're going to have to pull in other IT administrators and other teams as well from time to time. And that's going to be super critical to get various things done. So here's a good point where I can stop before we dive into talking about the Power BI service specifically and managing it, to see if we have any high-level questions at this point.
So if there are any questions, feel free to drop them in chat and I will forward them on to Melissa.
Okay, well, I'll move on then and we'll have a chance to catch those up here in a couple of minutes if any of them come through. Where I'd like to start talking about the Power BI service are tenant settings, because they really are very important to get right. And so what I want to do is basically highlight a few of them. So where I'm at, just in case you have not seen it, is I've gone to the admin portal and I'm on the tenant settings page. So just to highlight, 3 or 4 of them, because they're all important. But one of them that's really quite important is this idea of, well, who can create workspaces? And in my tenant, or in my demo tenant here, I've got a Power BI workspace creators group. And, in addition to the administrators and the support team that is able to create workspaces. So this is one of those big decisions where, depending on how you handle things like creating SharePoint sites and Teams channels and so forth, right? You'll probably have Power BI react the same way. If it's very wide open, then your workspace creation will be wide open. If it's fairly narrow in who is able to create it, Power BI might follow suit as well. You might be allowing anyone to share content with external users. If that's extremely prevalent in your organization, you might have it restricted if in fact that is very, very uncommon in your organization. Something like certification. So this is who can certify a data set and set that data set endorsement. And so, this shouldn't be your Power BI administrators. This should be someone from the business side that is a subject matter expert and who has been granted the authority to set that property. And then just interesting, because I just noticed it today, so it's popped up sometime recently, is this shared teams. And so we're seeing more and more integration with other tools like Microsoft Teams. So we have a relatively new tenant setting here that I happen to just notice. So we know tenant settings are important to get right. So here are the things that I want you to consider doing. And the first one is to document why you made the decisions. So for instance, you have decided we're not going to allow export to Excel, for instance. That's a very heavy-handed decision, and it does limit your users. So if you decide to do that, documenting why and who made the decision, it usually should not be you, the administrator. It should be someone higher than that, right? Us, the administrators, are not usually the decision maker. And then I want you to also document those settings for the rest of your user population to view. And then if they want to be able to do something, which group do they need to ask for to be included in? So if they want to be able to certify data sets, okay, I have to be a member of this group, and here's how I become a member of that. Or I want to be able to push my apps to end users. Which group is allowed to do that? Things like that. And finally, there is the updated admin feature switch in your activity log. And that tells you in your audit log or your activity log, oh, something changed in your tenant settings. And once you get your tenant settings right, you want to make sure that nothing is changed inadvertently. And so the last suggestion is to think about maybe setting up alerts for if a tenant setting does change. And if you are in a bigger decentralized organization, you might become under pressure to give various people throughout the organization this administrator role so they can get in and at least see what's going on, because there is no view only role. I would really like it if there were, but there isn't. So your risk goes up the more people have the Power BI administrator role. So this idea of alerts, there's two different ways that you can do alerts, and I'm going to show you one way, and it's with a tool called Cloud App Security. And incidentally, Cloud App Security is a totally separate from Power BI, so separate security role to get into it and do this, separate subscription, all that kind of thing. But it's very cool. And so what I'm showing you here is I happen to have 3 Power BI policies in my setup here. And so one of them, this third one, I set up myself. We'll talk about the other 2 a little bit later, but this first one I set up. And basically what I did, and that was nice. It wanted to refresh to the main page. So let's try that again. That's what I get for prepping it before we started. So we give it a name and a description. And every time that this particular activity happens, when the app is Power BI and administrative activity is true, what I am asking for it to do is send an alert to my Power BI administrators group. Now I could do other things like send a text message or even loop it in with Power Automate. And then with regard to policies, there's also other things that you could take action on. These kinds of other governance actions, those are more like, oh, I am seeing an impossible login that's over in, I don't know, across the world that I know people aren't there. So if I see that, maybe, take some other action, that kind of thing. So a few things that we can do. And then once that happens, you would get an email like this that says, oh, according to my activity policy, I see that the feature printing has been changed to true. And that was done by Griffin at this particular time. Now, a few caveats to this is that it tells you that this setting was true. Doesn't mean it wasn't true before. It could be that a new group was added. It just means that a change occurred. And so it's not a full end-to-end featured kind of thing. And also it's not real time. So your activity log or your usage auditing isn't real time. Neither is this, but once it's all up and running, you usually get this alert within a couple of hours. I've heard people say as much as 4 or 5, but if nothing else, it's at least a additional thing that you can do to complement your activity logging. And that's again where your documentation just might also help out. So you all should know the answer to this because I already gave you the answer. But at this point in time, if I asked you if the Power BI admin role is very high privilege, what would you say? Good job, good job. Do I have any cowboys that are gonna, that are gonna fight me? Now somebody's gonna do it just to be funny. All right, so the answer is of course yes. Oh, see, there we go. Gotta have somebody that's funny. One of the other things that administrator can get to is this area of workspace management. And so back in the admin portal, here is the view of all of the workspaces across the entire tenant. Now this also includes the personal workspaces. So we can start seeing personal workspaces for Griffin, Sadie, etc. Now for the non-personal workspaces, and I still fumble over this a little bit because for a long time these were referred to as app workspaces, right? We've got our list here, and at the top we have my workspace, which is available to only me, and then we have the rest of them, which are no longer technically referred to as app workspaces, they're just workspaces. So anyways, for those kind, the non-personals, I could edit the details and I can also update the access or the security. So this is just to reiterate that a second time in this session, why I consider the administrator role to be pretty high privilege, beyond the fact that you can actually see the activity data of who did what when. That's all available to an administrator. Another thing in the admin portal is the management of your embed codes. And so, this is something that's mentioned a lot. So we won't spend a lot of time here, but this is related to the publish to web feature. And we almost always want that to be really very locked down, and we can track it in the activity log. And there's the embed codes page where on an occasional basis, twice a year, quarterly, whatever, you can just validate that these embed codes are still valid, we should keep them, etc. Now, organizational visuals, this is a important one to get right. And what I like to recommend is, first of all, in your tenant settings, there is a yes, no, true, false to say, do we want to require the use of certified visuals only? And so a certified visual means it came from AppSource and that there has been some basic Microsoft reviews done on it. There's no malicious code. It's not sending data back to a server anywhere, things like that. To make sure that a user gets the exact same experience in Power BI Desktop, there's a group policy that can be set. If you just Google group policy certified visuals, you'll find it. And so that's a really important thing to do 1 and 2 together, because otherwise you're going to have people spending time doing development in Power BI Desktop just to be annoyed that they can't view it in the service. Now you might say, Melissa, I've got organizational visuals that aren't certified, so I can't set that. And so how we handle exceptions is through this organizational visuals pane in the admin portal. And so, for instance, maybe you've internally developed something that's not coming from AppSource, or maybe you absolutely have a visual that's trustworthy from, say, a vendor you bought it from. It can't get certified because it's transmitting data back, but perhaps it's calling something like a machine learning algorithm. So of course it has to transmit data back, and that's perfectly valid. So you understand it, you trust the vendor, you want to use it. This organizational visuals pane is exactly how you manage it. And this is the place to do it, because if your users are managing those individual PBI viz files, then each one has its own version. Whereas if you manage it here, changes to the version will automatically get pushed to all the users that are using that custom visual. So it's much, much more seamless than the alternative. Data flow settings. So here's where what you would do is you would hook up, if you have a Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 account over in Azure, and you said, I'm using data flows, I want to literally be able to see that data in the data lake behind the scenes. And so there are some limitations with it right now. The release plan mentions that there's some new integrations coming. My thought here is really just be careful when you're doing any sort of POCs right now, because the integration here still is kind of growing up, if you will. There's also a featured content area, and this is one of those areas where an administrator kind of needs to partner with the business users to say, well, who's allowed to promote content on the homepage? And so this is a situation where featured content should be fairly sparingly used and monitored to make sure that it's being used well. And finally, in this section, I just want to point out, if you need to keep track of what's going on from a system health perspective, there's the Power BI support site, and that would be where they would put items for just very broad public awareness. Then you've also got Azure status. And of course, if you're using Power BI embedded, that's where you would get its status. But you might also have other services integrated with Power BI, like Azure Data Lake Storage or cognitive services, machine learning, et cetera, et cetera. Finally, in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, there's also a service health area. And the history here is for 30 days. And if there's a high priority incident, this is where you would go and you would find the formal write-up of, here's the root cause, the user impact, the start and end time, all that kind of stuff. So more details than you would get from, say, that support site up at the top left. But that's not for everything. That's just for the high priority incidents. All right, Kevin, do we have any questions to address at this point?
Looks like the answer is no so far, but if I vamp for just a moment, it's possible that somebody might type in something, maybe furiously typing right now in the hopes that they'll be able to finish it up in time, or I take a breath, but in that case, they're too.
Excellent.
No, it looks like no questions yet.
All right, they're taking it easy on me. I like it. All right, so this next section is really short, so if you are frantically typing, we'll see it here very shortly. This is a hugely important topic, and one that's sort of near and dear to me because I've spent a lot of time in this area in the last couple of years. And that's around the idea of usage auditing, activity monitoring. Those are used interchangeably these days. And I first want to start with, well, why this idea of usage monitoring is so hypercritical. And so the first one is, finding what's used most. What if a data refresh isn't as reliable as it should be? Or what if a report is shared from someone's My Workspace and suddenly it's getting hundreds of views per day? We want to make sure that thing is supported and we know about it, et cetera. With regard to change tracking, I would want to know about in addition to content changes, I want to know about security changes. And with regard to auditing, this data is absolutely invaluable for compliance, audits, security investigations, things like that. And so for security, by the way, in addition to the actual usage log data, you'll also want snapshots of what security looked like at different points in time. And we'll talk about that a little more here in a moment. We can start talking about adoption efforts, and usage itself is a big part of adoption, but it's not the only part. Think about it this way: more usage stats is not always a positive thing. More downloads or more data models, even more reports, isn't always exactly what we want. Maybe we want smarter, more flexible reports, for instance. So, adoption, in addition to usage, is also about using the technology the way it was intended, but that's obviously way harder to track. Trustworthiness. So are we seeing data set certification and reuse? And licenses. Do we have some pro licenses not being actively used? Or are there pro users who are only consuming content? And so maybe we can move them to viewing content over in premium instead. Or maybe we have people that have fired up trials and don't have a pro license, so they're going to have a service interruption here soon if we don't assign a license. And then here, this is getting harder, but understanding usage patterns. So are too many exports happening? Or are there a significant number of subscriptions in place rather than dynamic report rendering? Things like that could mean that there are unmet needs and some refactoring that could be justifiable. Training. What if you see someone doing a lot of sharing from My Workspace, and then you directed them to information about why workspaces and apps are better than sharing from My Workspace? What if you see a lot of data sets published by the same author, and they could be duplicative? So you direct them to information about shared data sets. What if you detected the first time a newly licensed user viewed or published content, and you sent them a nice email making sure they're aware of our internal training and documentation? Or maybe you see a user who does a lot of Excel reports, and you let them know that, hey, there's this thing called Analyze in Excel, which is a better thing to use. So you can do a lot with understanding how the system's being used. And then, more on the nefarious side, maybe if we start to see things that are suspicious, like a massive number of data exports that, is by one user, what does that mean? That's not typical. A Power BI auditing solution end-to-end ends up involving a few things. So if we start at the top left, we've got the Power BI activity log, which comes from the Office 365 audit log, or Microsoft 365. Old habits die hard. Then we like to get some data out of the Power BI REST APIs. So things like workspace inventories, things like how many reports do I have in this workspace, things like that for an inventory. And that helps us bounce that data against the activity log to say, oh, you know what, there are 42 reports in this workspace, but only half of them get any regular use. Workspace security, so that's that snapshot that I like to keep on, say, a weekly or monthly basis, and that coupled with your activity log data really gives you a full picture of what your security is. But to do any of that and do good reporting, we also need to pull some data out of Azure Active Directory. So a list of users. The activity log only is going to give us an email address. So we would like things like full name, department, etc. We would like to say, oh, if I see security on a group, well, who are the members of that group? So that then I can marry that up if I need to. We can also pull out who our pro license people are. And then optional, finally at the top right, we can start bringing in some of the gateway log data if it makes sense to. Now that's one that, contrary to the rest of them, doesn't really have as much long-term benefit. So we may or may not end up doing quite as much with those. But generally speaking, I usually use PowerShell in order to coordinate getting all of that data. What I like to do is drop it into a data lake or a file system if a customer really just isn't ready for a data lake kind of situation. And then we prepare the data for reporting and drop it in some sort of database, which is shown in the bottom center. And then, like you would expect, create reports on them that do things like, evaluating our adoption and doing our auditing reports, et cetera. And then I would propose, because we've done all this work, we can actually make that report available to a broader set of users so they can understand easier what's happening across their entire workspaces. Now, to go back a moment to the bottom left and this idea of a data lake, we also want to make sure that this raw data is reliable for our auditors if we need it to be. So I advocate that when you pull the data out of the activity log initially, do not parse it initially. Just pull the flat JSON data. That's going to do two things for you. One is, the biggest one is that you are not going to miss when a new attribute is added, because new things come along all the time. Of course it does. It's Power BI. And also it means that your first script that pulls data is kind of just a dumb script. All it does is go get the data. It doesn't do the smart thing and say, oh, I want this and this and this and this and this. Also, if you drop it in a location that is considered immutable, meaning once that file is written, nobody can change it, nobody can edit it, that means it can be reliable for your auditors because nobody's ever going to monkey with it. So that's kind of the end-to-end picture. What I haven't shown on here, the Power BI release plan, there is some integration with Azure Monitor coming. I don't know how that's going to change this. I also don't know yet how this is going to change on the release plan. The metrics here, this thing here, usage metrics in the admin portal, enhancing these is also on the release plan. So, how that will affect what we do today is an unknown for right now, but watching the release plan is super important. There's a few different ways that we can get usage monitoring data. I could talk for a long time about the 4 different ways. What I want you to walk away with, if you're not doing it yet, is go after this Power BI activity log. It's the newest way to get data out of a PowerShell commandlet. It's just easier. So if you're just getting started, focus on that. Don't get distracted by an older PowerShell commandlet that I named it at the bottom right here. That one's got a variety of limitations. Definitely go with the new one. Now, just a few tips here. In order to really do this well, you've got to know what your normal is and when something is actually unusual. So that lets you, in addition to saying, well, I know what happened last week or last month, that it allows you to start taking action early, being proactive, basically. You want to accumulate history. If I have my choice, I want, at least a year or two of that usage log data in order to be able to see how the trends change over time. Here's the whole spiel about the raw data files that you just heard me talk about a moment ago. And then correlating data, so the different areas across the top with the activity log, the APIs, the Azure AD data, just like anything with analyzing data, it always becomes more useful when we correlate it with other data. So I have a question for you, and that is if you're currently capturing your activity data, how are you doing it now? And this also concludes our section if there are any questions that you wanted to type in as well.
We have several questions. They've all come flooding in. So the first one was from a person who just recently got in. Is there an area where you can manage gateways?
There is. If you hold that thought, we are specifically going to talk about gateways and the couple different places that you manage them in just 2 sections from now. So we're going to hit that in about 12-ish minutes.
All right, stay tuned, Raymond. Next question. This is a series of questions. First, do customers really build these complex BI on BI solutions?
Absolutely. I've done it for 3 different customers in the last year. So yeah, absolutely. This data is positively invaluable.
Okay. How long does it normally take?
The first time it took me ages. So I think that depends on your starting point. So do you know PowerShell? Do you know how to call APIs? Things like that. So the first time I did this, I was using the Office 365 Management API, which was fundamentally more difficult to get the data out than the activity log. So we've gotten a newer way to do things that, there's a few less things we have to do to turn around and authenticate and parse out data we don't want, et cetera, et cetera. So I can't really tell you how long, but it will take some time and effort for sure.
Okay, and what parts would you consider the most important and the most common there?
Yeah, so I would say that your absolute most important data is this Power BI activity log data up here at the top left. That stuff is gold. So all of the different reasons that I went through on these other pages about why usage monitoring is critical, almost all of that we get out of that Power BI activity log.
Great. The next question here, do you have any recommendations for integrating Power BI reports into applications?
Oh, yeah. So embedding is kind of a different animal. So, heck, Kevin, you might have, more feedback than I do. So the thing that comes to mind is just that you still publish your data and or reports and dashboards to the Power BI service like normal, right? And then you pick it up and turn around and embed it elsewhere. And so I would just say kind of use those 2 sets of people for what they're good at, right? Your business person that prepares the reports and such can still do that. And then if you're using the full-fledged APIs, someone that knows how to do that to integrate it into the custom app can do that. But there's also what we call the no code way as well. And I actually have a couple of slides on this on that same presentations page. There's a Power BI architecture end to end, and I've got like 2 or 3 slides on embedding and the couple different ways that you can attack it. So and then also, if you go to, I've got a link for this at the end of the presentation. But if you just search for Power BI white papers, it's still at the top of the list. Planning a Power BI enterprise deployment. We just released a new update to this, and I actually rewrote the section on embedding to take away some of the things that were distracting and make it more like, well, how do I decide which type of embedding should I use? So I would say check out that section in that white paper if you haven't seen it already.
Great. I put links to both of those in chat.
Wonderful.
That looks like all the questions for the moment.
Okay, let's see what our results ended up being. All right. Sounds good. Thanks, everybody. So closely correlated with what we just talked about is automation in general. And In the world of Power BI, there's really kind of two main buckets of that we tend to think about. So PowerShell and then the REST APIs. And yes, I know we can call the REST APIs from PowerShell, but cut me some slack on this for a moment. So when I say PowerShell here, I mean that there's a couple of modules that are published by Microsoft that have some built-in commandlets that fundamentally do the same thing as the REST APIs, but just a little bit easier to use because they're commandlets. And when you call these commandlets, you can specify a scope. So for instance, let's say you would like a list of workspaces. You can say my scope is organization, and that will pull back the list of workspaces across the whole tenant. But here's the cool thing. Let's say you're not a Power BI administrator, but you are a techie Power BI user who's not scared of rolling a little PowerShell. They can still use that individual scope and run some scripts against things that they have permission to. So that's basically what the individual scope would do. I would like to know if you are doing very much yet with automation, and if so, if there's something interesting that you'd like to share. While you're typing in, this one's free form, I'm going to keep talking about a few other things, and then we'll see these results here in a minute or two. So the first module that is really critical if you wanted to use the built-in commandlets is called the Power BI Management module. And that's where that activity log data comes from. You can also do things like get a list of users per workspace. This is how we can get, lists of reports, dashboards, etc. We can also start doing some things like I want to create a workspace. So if you like to script out some things that you do regularly rather than doing it in the browser, we can start doing that as well. There is a separate module called the Data Gateway module with respect to managing our gateway clusters. So here we can do things like, getting a list of our clusters, our list of data sources registered per gateway. Very new. The version 1 of it was just released to help us automate the installation of a gateway cluster. And that's huge. Customers have been screaming for the last couple of years. So, our first iteration of that has just come out, and that's really nice because, of course, the gateway software is updated every month. The one thing to know is that if you're still using PowerShell 5.1, you can use that with that management module that we talked about on the last slide. But you need, initially it was PowerShell Core 6, and now it's moved to PowerShell 7. So the gateway modules are very much saying, you need to be current. Incidentally, just kind of a quick side note, if I go back a second, this thing right here for getting the activity log data, if you like to use VS Code, if you're still on PowerShell 5.1 and you're using VS Code, this activity log data might come back all blanks for you. And so if you end up upgrading to PowerShell 7, all of the underlying things that get installed basically correct the issue with that. So get current if you're not is basically the message there. Now, those are the two sets of modules that Microsoft supports. Then there's a whole slew of REST APIs. And so here's the thing you got to remember is that the APIs have a whole lot more options than the management module. So the management module commandlets are a little bit easier, but you can do way more with the REST APIs. The REST APIs don't do absolutely everything that you can do in the Power BI service. Hopefully one day we'll have parity, but at this point, there's still some things that you will have to point and click in the browser to do. And then thirdly, this is very cool and kind of the thing that I try to do now if it works with the customer, and that is doing authentication with the Power BI management module because it's just plain easier. And then if I need to call an API, I still use the management module as kind of a wrapper. And then I just call an API from it. And so we can, the idea here is to combine them, get the best of both worlds. How I would do that is it's called invoke dash Power BI REST method. And that's a little bit different. It's got, right after the invoke, it's got Power BI rather than just invoke REST method. So slightly different when you're calling it from within the management module. From an automation standpoint, another very new thing is the XMLA endpoint. And that's basically a way for you to communicate with Power BI in the service and a client application. So we can start doing things like connecting Management Studio to a data set, for instance. So this, is a topic all on its own, but do be aware that it's a premium capacity feature at the moment, but opens up a whole lot of new use cases for enterprise BI scenarios. And the final thing that I want to hit on for automation is making sure that user software remains updated. So there's a few flavors of the Power BI software. The first one is just the regular Power BI desktop. It gets monthly updates. Ideally, what you want to do is make sure that that's pushed to your user population. And so you can do that through the Microsoft Store if your company allows it. There's a installer executable from the web. And then there's, obviously you can hook that up with organizational deployment software if in fact you've got something of that nature, but you want to make sure that everybody's on the same version. That's important because let's say I work on the data model and I want to pass it over to Kevin to create the reports. If I'm on a newer version, he's going to have a problem, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's a few other options that may or may not be in play depending on what you're doing. And in addition to the Power BI software, a few other things that you might have to get installed on user machines are some drivers, depending on what data sources someone might access. There's a provider for analyzing Excel. You might have some group policies that you want to push, like the custom visuals thing that we talked about earlier. And then if in fact you've got some sort of custom connector for a specific specialty kind of data source. And all of these, with the exception of the group policy one and the analyze in Excel, drivers and connectors, the same thing would have to get installed on your gateway machine as well. So let's see what you all said as far as using automation. Yeah, I agree. The XMLA endpoint has a lot of possibilities. Yeah, I really like the Power App with a Power Automate flow for requesting things like new workspaces. So when a customer wants to restrict who's allowed to create workspaces, the first thing I say is, okay, we need to make it easy for people to request a new one then. And so, is there a form like a Power App, and how fast can we push it through? Because if it takes a pretty long time for us to turn around and respond to that request, people are going to start using an existing workspace that kind of wasn't meant for whatever new topic they have, or they're going to start sharing out of my workspace. So I like that aspect that you discussed there. The REST APIs with the log information turned into dashboards. Love it. Love it, love it. Love it. Yep, love everything you just said there. Trigger on file brow, inventory planning and routing. Interesting. Okay. Yeah, very cool, everybody.
I have to say that was very trusting, having an open text box that anybody could put anything in and show up.
I know nobody's written anything, rotten yet. So we'll see if I'm ever sorry I did that.
we do have one question.
Yes. I'm sorry. Thank you for reminding me.
Sure. Are the PowerShell scripts that you had mentioned cross-platform or Windows only?
The newest versions of PowerShell, I believe, are becoming cross-platform, right, Kevin?
So PowerShell itself, yes, but I think it's more the commandlets that, or the module that you can use for Power BI management.
Well, you know what? We can answer that really quick. So hang on, because I should know the answer to that. And as always, be careful. What comes back in Google is not always the latest version. But let's see here what it says. Details. That's not what we want. I'd have to check and see if these are compatible with anything besides Windows. I don't see any restrictions documented. But I don't know the answer to that. I'm sorry.
Fair enough.
Okay. All right, so that moves us to security. That we're gonna just mention a few key things really quickly. This is obviously a massive topic. So the first item is just to know that, integration with Azure Active Directory and, securing and protecting the identity is a huge thing. And that identity or person needs a Power BI free or a Power BI Pro account for working in the Power BI service. You don't actually need it for Power BI Desktop, although it will continue to ask you to sign in. So that is kind of the best experience as if you're logged in. But the two exceptions to needing an identity for Power BI to authenticate with is if the content is published publicly, so that's the publish to web, where it's really just embedded in an iframe on a website somewhere, or if you're using Power BI embedded in conjunction when the app is handling all the authentication. So both of those are possible. Now, we can use Azure Active Directory conditional access to do some really interesting things. So this isn't Power BI specific for the most part, but it's important to know. So, maybe we've got some policies around, where you're allowed to log in from. And, business intelligence data can be very sensitive. So sometimes these are kind of a hot topic. It's also possible we can do things like only allowing logins to the Power BI application from a certain AAD group. So, of course, if we have some policies there or processes that we want to follow for, how you procure a license, do you need to get some training first, right? You can kind of loop in membership in a group along with some different processes. There's also some identity governance features in Azure AD that you might find useful. So terms of use is one. So let's say you want your users to agree to maybe a data privacy policy or maybe a data handling policy before they're off and running to Power BI. And so the terms of use within Azure AD is one way to have people acknowledge that. There's access reviews. So really the idea here is I want to find the issues before an auditor does. So I would periodically review who's in certain group memberships and confirm or attest that, yes, that's correct or adjust it. And third, there's that privileged identity management that we talked about way at the beginning. There is this that I have two videos on in terms of all of the different kinds of things that a content author might manage with respect to permissions. And so by content author, I mean, that self-service BI user that is publishing data and reports for others to consume. So I'm not going to go through all of this, but, training on security best practices is important. And it's always really nice when a Power BI administrator knows enough about Power BI and how this kind of stuff is being used so they can get in and help and answer questions. With regard to the gateway, there's a couple of levels of permissions. So at the gateway level, we can specify who's allowed to administer the gateway. I'm going to show you what that looks like here in just a couple minutes. And then at the specific data source level, so let's say we're registering a SQL server to be able to connect to that through a gateway. We might have some stored credentials there. So that's another reason that our gateway administrator might be kind of a high privilege role. We can also say we'd rather use single sign-on instead of stored credentials. There's also the notion of data privacy levels, which can affect how much data is passed to a data source or what maybe is passed back to Power BI itself. Another thing that is sometimes overlooked is, from a security standpoint, is where files are located. So the first one really is, where are the source Power BI files being stored? So by that, the PBIX file, if you're importing data, as well as creating reports, data is sitting in that Power BI file. So where's it being stored, and is it at a place that basically aligns with the same thing as workspace security, up in the service? But in addition to that, we might have some source data files, maybe some flat files or Excel. Where are those sitting, and is it secure? What if I've got some subscriptions or exports out of the Power BI service that I'm saving off? Having our users save those in an approved kind of location as well that that aligns with organizationally what they should be doing there. There's also a fairly new feature. It just went GA, and it's data sensitivity levels. And so there's a tenant setting that controls who's allowed to assign a sensitivity level. But in the Power BI service, if I just pop over to a workspace, for each individual item, I can say, well, what kind of sensitivity, easy for me to say, right? What level should it be, right? And there's this little information that I can pop up to get a little bit more of a description to know for instance, what is the difference between restricted and highly confidential. And so where we would set those up is in the Security and Compliance Center. Under classification, there is a sensitivity labels section. So those labels in Power BI are integrated with the labels right here. So I'm not going to elaborate on it a lot, but that means that we can also take advantage of these labels in other applications like our Office applications and so forth. And if I were to say export this report out to Excel, the label will go with it. Things like that are really nice. From an administrator standpoint, under protection metrics, there's a little report that gives us at least a high-level view of how many objects are assigned to each of the labels, and then a hyperlink to go back out to Cloud App Security if you'd like to. With regard to those sensitivity labels, here's the thing. In addition to just being informational, you kind of want them to be actionable and make it very clear, based on this label, what are you allowed or not allowed to do? Who's allowed to see it? So a label like internal only is kind of self-explanatory there. But are you allowed to download it to your local machine? Do you have to do a marking? And the labels can be configured to have a footer, for instance, or something like that. And maybe if you use this data, maybe you are required to anonymize it. Things like that should be part of your data handling policy so that people understand what they are and are not actually allowed to do with the data. And then there's a very cool thing also in Cloud App Security for detecting risky activities. And these are really neat because, let me find the correct window. These are generated by the system. So there's two of them right now. One of them is multiple report sharing activities. One of them is suspicious report sharing. And I did not configure these. So as you can see, I adjusted it to say, go ahead and send me an alert to my Power BI administrators and my security administrators if this happens. But there's actually no rules here. And the reason for that is because this is actually, this is AI. It's doing some anomaly detection that atypical activity is happening with regard to report sharing. And so those are some new functionality that is very cool. I'm excited to see where this continues to go. And last but not least in this section is just to make you aware that there are a few different kinds of encryption keys that as an administrator, you'll need to make sure that they have a safe home. Preferably, you have some sort of corporate password vault that you're using, but somewhere that the other admins can get to it if it's necessary and all that. All right, Mr. Kevin, any questions before we get into gateways?
We do have a question. Can the Graph API be used for authentication here, like getting user group info and passing it to reports?
So the API, if you were calling the API and not using that management module, what you would do is you would fire up an Azure Active Directory app, also known as a service principal. You would give it permissions like tenant read all, that kind of thing, or even narrower if you'd like. And then you use what's it called? What's the full name? It's ADAL, ADAL, is the acronym. You would use that kind of authentication with the service principal in order to call the API. It's not that bad once you set it up, right? But it's a little bit more work than just authenticating through the management module, which is I like easy. So assuming that it doesn't violate any security issues, that way's easier. But yeah, you can go through the service principal as well. And if you do that, there's also a tenant setting that that you need to flip on that allows service principals to run the APIs. And there's also currently a limitation that there's a set of, when you call the APIs, there's like, I don't know, 8 or 10 different sections, and one section is admin APIs. Service principals are still not supported to call the admin APIs, but they are supported to call all the rest of them.
Great, thank you.
Okay, sure thing. Just a heads up, we're like almost 10 minutes behind schedule, so I'll see if I can catch us up, but we'll run just a few minutes long if that's okay. Gateways. There are 2 types of gateways. The first one is considered personal mode, and the other one is called standard mode. I can't seem to stop calling it enterprise mode because I like it better, but technically it's called standard mode. And as I depict here, the personal mode is really intended for one person, and the standard mode is a gateway cluster. So here I'm showing that we've added 3 servers to the cluster. And when you're reading the documentation, even if you only have one gateway server, it's still called a cluster, terminology-wise. So here's just a little bit of the differences on the 2 modes. My advice is use standard mode whenever you can and whenever is practical, because it makes data sources reusable across a variety of users. We get logging. It also facilitates things like direct query and live connection in addition to data refresh and so forth. The standard mode gateway also supports more than just Power BI. It supports all these other services listed across the top as well. The thing to know though is that those different services will share the gateway server for connectivity, but they don't share the same data sources. So if I registered for data sources in Power BI service, Power Apps doesn't see them. No idea if that's going to change at some point here, but just kind of know that it's not 100% end-to-end integration. And then also be aware that this gateway is a different thing than an Azure Data Factory gateway. So totally independent. Let's talk for a moment about when do we need a gateway. And so the first thing is we won't need it until we get content up to the Power BI service. And so we'll need it when we're refreshing a data set, a data flow, using direct query, or using live connection. And our data source is on premises, or it could be sitting in another type of cloud service, but we've got it inside, say, a virtual network. And so I mention this because a lot of times you see just a really short statement that, oh, if it's a cloud data source, you don't need a gateway. And that's not always true, right? Because when you start wrapping virtual networks around data, then it acts like it's on premises and it acts like it's in your own data center. And more companies are adding those to improve security. And then the last thing is there's a few pieces of functionality that also kind of make you need a gateway. And, Chris Webb told me about these. We added them in the white paper. So it's not a full list, but just be aware that there are a couple of oddities that pop up from time to time. Now, there was a question earlier about where do we manage gateways? And I'm not going to go through this whole thing, but the message that I want to send you is gateways are basically managed fundamentally two different places. There's some things done in the Power Platform Admin Center, some in the Power BI service. Then you've got the gateway server itself, right? Where you would install the software. It's also where you'd view your logs and, make sure that the server's healthy and so forth. And then there's some things that you can do with PowerShell as well, instead of in these interactive areas. So let me show you what this Power Platform Admin Center looks like, because it's the thing that is a little bit less commonly known. So Power Platform Center is also used by other Power Platform tools like Power Apps and such. Here you can see I've got one data gateway. One heads up, in this interface, it's called users. This is actually referring to administrators. So if I were to manage users here, you can see Peyton and a group, Power BI Gateway administrators. Those guys are actually my administrators for the gateway. What I can't do over here is manage my data sources. So I would still manage those in the Power BI service. So I go over here. I've currently just got one data source registered called Enterprise DW, how we're connecting. And then over here is the data source users, and that would be the people that are allowed to use this data source for connectivity, use it for an import or etc. So the one thing that I do want to point out that is over here is this idea of who's allowed to manage or install the gateway software. So you can turn this on to restrict users who can install gateways. And so for right now, I've just got 2 people that are allowed to install gateways. So basically in the PowerShell commandlets, you've got some policies. And so you can use those policies in conjunction with your installers to control things like who can install personal gateways and that kind of thing. This is what I just showed you in the portal. Let me know if you allow the use of personal gateways, and I'll come back and check here in just a second. With regard to setting up gateways, my proposal is that you've got 2. So one is your production gateway cluster, which has at least 2 servers, and that lets you make sure that you don't have a single point of failure. If you're doing your monthly updates, you've always got one up and running while you're doing the updates on the other. It also does some nice load balancing and that sort of thing. Now, I propose that you also have a dev test gateway cluster. And in this case, I actually don't even care if it's even just one server for this purpose. It can certainly be less powerful. I don't care about this matching production for testing performance. If you do, that's fine. But the most thing that I'm worried about with this dev test gateway is I have a place to install the monthly update first, run a few reports to make sure everything is behaving fine, right? One that uses import, one that uses direct query, right? With the handful of different scenarios that I know are going to process through that gateway. Make sure the logs are still collecting data. There are hiccups once in a while with the gateway software. And so having this dev test box is just very, very helpful before you go and touch production. With regard to your server specs, one thing that is really important to know is that it does more than just connectivity. And so depending on what you're doing, it might actually be, doing some actual data work to filter data or merge it or whatever. And so your rules of thumb are CPU is more important for direct query and live connection. Memory is, crucial for data refresh operations. And of course, your networking is always important. I'm curious if at the moment you have at least 2 machines in your production gateway cluster or not. Yay, I see some yeses. And hopefully if you don't, that you will improve that soon. I like it. Good answers, I like it. Here's some things that you need to install on the gateway server. You've got the software, you've got custom drivers, custom connectors. That software is updated once a month. You don't necessarily have to update it once a month. I would try to get into a cadence of at least every other month or quarterly, and don't let it get too far behind. Make sure it's still pretty darn current. And then we alluded to this earlier, but do know that the administrators are set at the cluster level and your users are set per individual data source. And so the reason that this is really important to know is, let's say a user publishes a Power BI desktop file and it uses a brand new data source. They try to schedule an import, it's going to fail. So from a support perspective, you've got to be prepared to register a new data source for them quickly. Or maybe the data source is already registered, but they don't appear in the user list. Get that user permissions quickly. So it's important to be able to handle these things so that the user population doesn't get angry. From a monitoring standpoint, several months ago, there was some new logs released. And so there's a config file on the gateway server that you would enable. And then what it does is it produces these 4 different log files. And what these do for you is it just makes it easier to get at some data that's, I think, is way easier than reaching into perfmon. And so you can configure it to say, for certain things like the system counter aggregations, every, say, 5 minutes or the interval that you configure, it will tell you what your CPU usage is and your memory usage is and so forth. So you can use that for things like, are we really clogged from 6 to 7 a.m. with a whole lot of refreshes going on, and can we spread those out? Or over time, are we seeing more and more demand telling us that, oh, we're going to have to scale up or out soon on the gateway? Things like that. All right, questions before we start premium capacity?
Yes, there's a question about where are those configuration items for the gateway?
Yeah, they're in the, I do have the VM running, but I don't have it up. They are in just a very default location. It would take me a minute to find it. Oh, I know. Check that same Power BI white paper. I'm almost certain that I've put the path in there, but if you at least search for the name of the long file, it will give you the path. So, so sorry, I don't remember it off the top of my head, but the one thing I would change, if you turn on those log files, the default path where it wants to send them, I think is a little bit unusual. And so I usually like to send them to a different path. I like to keep them initially on the same server so that we're not incurring any networking to initially write them, but just in a different path.
Okay. And is there any one place that lists all of the different sources, logs, APIs, etc., someone would need in order to build the auditing solution from the big diagram you showed earlier?
Good question. I think part of that might depend on what it is you want to do. So there is, from a reference perspective, so there is the Power BI REST API reference. And so here it's just under docs, whatever your geographic is, REST API, and then Power BI. Here's all of the different options that you have. And so I don't have it, collected in a nice tidy list or anything like that, but I think part of it is assessing what information is important to you. So for instance, you can get that, the activity events, you can get it from either calling this API or, or the commandlet. So if I just pull up one, here's the actual commandlet. And if I kind of go to a one level higher, we're at the management module reference. So basically between the two, you kind of see that there's the different categories, and that's where you would find at least the list of what is possible.
Excellent. The response was thank you. It seems very complicated.
Yeah, I hear you. Are we using premium now? Yes, considering it. Okay. All right. So premium is becoming more and more important. So just super quick, licensing, if we've got a ton of read-only users, it can become more cost effective, because the alternative would be I have to buy a pro license for everyone who is just viewing content. So the cutoff usually is about 500 users, ends up being a break-even point. Scalability, so things like large data set support and so forth fall into that. Some traditionally enterprise type features are coming to be available to self-service users. Deployment pipelines is a perfect example of that, but other things like the ability to view paginated reports, those are the RDLs from Power BI Desktop, optimized for report server. No, I think I said the wrong one there, but you know what I mean. The ability to view those in the service is a premium feature. Compliant, so certain things like if you need to ensure that the data resides within a certain geography, or if you need to manage your own key, that kind of thing. Certain integration like cognitive services and Azure machine learning is hooked up with data flows in and premium. And just the ability to have an alternate place to publish, the Power BI report server kind of just comes along for free with a premium capacity license. But just real quick, I mentioned data flows a moment ago. I do want to make sure that you're aware that there are some data flows features that are available without a premium capacity license. It just unlocks the full feature set. So I'm curious, if you are using premium, kind of what made you go there, or what can't you live without now? And I'll check your answers here in just a moment. There are two types of capacity. And here's the thing, especially when you're reading bloggers online, Some people are talking about Power BI Premium, and they literally mean that SKU. And other people talk about Power BI Premium, and they really mean they're talking about dedicated capacity, regardless of which way you buy it. So you kind of just have to figure out which person, which way they're attacking it. So Power BI Premium, you buy in Microsoft 365. Power BI Embedded, you purchase from Azure. And so really the thing here is that if you need to evaluate some premium capacity features, it's a very cool thing to be able to fire up Power BI Embedded, pause it when you're done. You only get charged by the hour instead of by the month. So if you don't need it up and running all the time, this can be a really cost-effective way to invoke certain features. So for instance, maybe you really want to use subscriptions from paginated reports. Well, fire up Embedded. That way you've got capacity active, then send your subscriptions and then pause Embedded. So you can do some interesting things like that if you don't need it up and running 24/7. When you set up your premium capacity, you are purchasing an amount of horsepower, if you will. So let's say we buy 32 cores. When I assign those or set them up inside the Power BI service, I can carve them up differently if I really want to. So maybe I bought a P3, but I'm going to actually configure 3 capacities in the service. And then each capacity then has workspaces assigned to one capacity to support the workload of those workspaces. So here's what it looks like. So I've created a capacity, and so then I can start saying, well, should I allow more of my memory to go to data flows, and should I turn AI off and on? And you can fine tune it to a certain extent. So one of your huge decisions is deciding, do I want to carve it up or do I not? So you might think about carving it up into smaller capacities if you need to isolate certain workloads, or if you've got, say, a smaller group and you need to give separate capacity administration privileges to certain people. But if you leave it as that larger capacity that you bought, like the P3 that we talked about, then you get more specs, right? You get the larger model sizes, you get more parallelism, etc. So it's a trade-off. You got to decide how you want to set it up. And from a monitoring perspective, there is the Premium Capacity Metrics app. So that's your built-in reports. And they've now released it as a template app. So if you wanted to use the data set from the template app and create your own custom reports, you can do that. There's also a tenant setting that will help you with notifications if there's any sort of incident going on, or if there's any overloads that are occurring in your capacity. It will alert you to that, which is a fairly recent thing that is an awesome improvement. And then also data from the activity log. So, maybe things are happening that didn't align with your expectations, so you don't have the workload configured quite right, things like that. So let's see what you all said a moment ago. Customer-specific reports, easy to deploy like SSRS. Yep, that is definitely a good one. All right, so we're going to wrap up with just a few suggestions, and then before we wrap, we'll handle any last Q&A that you have. So let's say you're just getting started overseeing Power BI. Where do you want to start? And my advice is, if you're not already doing it, start capturing that activity log data. Just start gathering it. And validate your tenant settings. Inside that white paper that I've mentioned a couple times, we included some tenant setting recommendations, so you can check there. Double check who has been granted your Power BI administrator role. Try to minimize the number of people. Maybe think about using that PIM functionality that we demoed at the very beginning to reduce the risk there. And if your gateway server is currently a single node, and if you have a gateway, chances are it's very important that it not go down. Add an extra one to that just to fundamentally reduce that single point of failure. So now let's say, Melissa, yeah, we got all that taken care of. What would I do next? Well, make sure that you have good analytical reporting for that activity log data and start augmenting it with other things that would make it even more valuable. And then I would say, start reviewing how you use workspaces and apps and naming conventions, and fundamentally, is the environment as clean as it could be? And do an end-to-end security review and set yourself up so that at any point in time, you know what the security was set to be. And if you're feeling pretty mature, where should you go next? So be proactive rather than reactive, especially with that activity log data, really understanding usage and contacting people or making decisions proactively. And think about maybe working with your governance teams or your support teams to improve trustworthiness. And usually that is aligned with using shared data sets more thoroughly rather than duplicating lots and lots of little data sets, right? And then things like data classifications. And if we do have policies, can we really manage them and audit them? So this kind of takes your self-service BI environment to that next level. I think we all feel the pain of the high pace of change. It's really important to follow the release plan. If you download this deck, I've got a link there for you. The Power BI blog is huge. So the Power BI blog is where I find information announced like, oh, there's a new PowerShell commandlet, or hey, next month the gateway is going to require a new .NET version, that kind of thing. And online information, it gets out of date quickly. So just try to watch dates. If something is 6 months old, just, be careful, always verify, but be even more careful. And final thoughts are try not to make decisions on the fly, right? Create things that are repeatable and so forth. And I like to think of an administrator role as we're helping people get things done, right? I cringe when somebody has the perspective of control and saying no. That is a big part of what we need to do, is safeguard our assets, but there's a balance there. And then also technical proof of concept is really important. No matter what we're talking about, I'm always telling customers, do a quick POC to verify it's going to do what you expect it to do, because features are released as kind of an MVP type of approach, a minimally viable product. And a lot of times it's more than that, but either way, it always takes time for them to mature and really become full featured and enterprise ready. So try to make sure that you just get in the habit of doing POCs. So Q&A before I open it up. I just want to remind you that here are all of the URLs, which I will come back to so that you have them. There are also at the end, I've included, a few pages of various URLs as well. So I will leave it here for anybody that needs to grab those, and we can handle any last questions that are out there.
Great. Question that popped up here was, do you have any recommendations on ebooks for Power BI administration or development?
There is one that Brett Powell authored. It's a couple years old now, but it's really good. Beyond that, I think I don't have anything, that's really comprehensive that comes to mind.
Okay. Are there any special considerations for admins that they should make that are not included here or typical when using Power BI for government cloud?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I haven't worked in the government tenants, So I do know that there are restrictions, but I'm not, I don't know what they are. So I don't have a good thought on that one. Sorry about that.
Okay, the next question definitely wasn't a question. This was fantastic. Thank you so much.
Oh, good. You're very welcome.
Fantastic was in all caps as well, so very, very fantastic.
Wonderful.
So
All
yeah, it
right.
looks like
Well,
that was all of the questions here.
all right. Well, sorry we ran a few minutes long, but thanks for sticking it out. And thank you for having me, Kevin.
Of course. And as we wrap this up, links are in the chat. If you have any follow-up questions, let me know. I know how to get a hold of Melissa. Or you can always go and grab the information from the presentations link. So, wrapping things up tonight, our next meeting will be on Monday. We've got Shop Talk, and next Tuesday, Rick Pack is going to talk to us about Excel and R. So until then, take care, everybody. Have a good one.